what comes to mind when you think of the word governance? Is it leadership? Is it system? Or maybe even good? Unsurprisingly, given the incredible diversity of human civilization, governance differs immensely across time and place. Nor is governance a static concept, being consistently changed and evolved through interactions with people and cultures, also known as encounters. One particular example of this lies in second millennium Asia, when the Mongols conquered the Seljuk Empire. Previously unconcerned and even disdainful of the governance systems of sedentary civilizations as opposed to nomadic ones, the Mongols soon realized what they were missing out on, and indeed adapted their governance systems to better manage these sedentary peoples and improve their own ways of doing things. When we look at governance in Canada today, some different words might come to mind. Monarchy, maybe constitutional, but more likely than not, democracy. And it is democracy that I would like you all to consider today. I would like you to challenge assumptions you may have and to consider whether or not democracy is truly fair. Now, what is democracy and what does it mean? Well, the word itself comes from the Greek demokratia, with demos meaning people and kratos meaning power, hence the rule of people. Now, there is really no consensus on how to define democracy, but there are some important characteristics that have been identified, including legal equality, political freedom, and the rule of law. Now, one theory about democracy holds that three fundamental principles are required to have democracy. These being upward control, or decision-making power being vested in the lowest level of society, political equality, and social norms based on the adherence of actions to those first two principles. Now, democracy in our common vernacular is often used as shorthand for what we call liberal democracy, which is a variant of democracy that includes political pluralism, equality before the law, and redress of grievances through governmental means, as well as due process, civil liberties, human rights, and critically, civil society. And indeed, one view on this, a very prominent view, holds that civil society is indeed required in order to provide the personal and political freedom that are often prized in democratic systems. A leading advocate for civil society involvement globally, His Highness the Aga Khan said in a speech to the Canadian Parliament, "Increasingly, I believe, the voices of civil society are voices for change, where change has been overdue. They are voices of hope for people living in fear. They are voices that can help transform countries of crisis into countries of opportunity." Now, moving beyond civil society as one of the key parts of many democratic societies, we identify a key characteristic that we have not previously mentioned, that being majority rule, which is really the underpinning of a democratic system. Now, this presents a couple issues. The first being the oppression of minorities by the possible tyranny of the majority, which can happen in many cases where minority groups do not have legal protection. As well, characteristics of modern democracies include fair and competitive elections, which are a fundamental part of a representative democracy. Now, going back in history, as I mentioned, democracy as a term first appeared in Greece, in Athens, meaning, as I mentioned, rule of the people. Now, some early instances of democracy can be found in England, as I'm sure many of you are familiar with the Magna Carta, which guaranteed certain rights, including eventually that of habeas corpus, or the right to be free from unlawful detention or unreasonable imprisonment. And this led to one of the first representative assemblies in Europe that we know of in England. Democracy then continued to spread, notably in North America, when in 1619, the first representative assembly on the continent was established in Virginia. Over the past 2 centuries, democracy has undergone tremendous growth globally, with a majority of states in the world nowadays being governed by either democratic or at least partially democratic systems, while local democracies on subnational levels are even more common. However, democracy is by no means a flawless system. And as His Highness the Aga Khan again said, democracy can fail anywhere, at any time, in any society. For it is self-evident in Europe and across the globe that the existence of political parties and elections do not alone produce stable governments or competent leadership. Now, democracy, in addition to being a complex topic generally, has many different forms, though there are 2 main versions of this, being direct democracy and representative democracy. In a direct democracy, systems function much like holding referenda on every single policy issue, where citizens will vote, and their vote will directly determine the outcome and the policy adopted. This system excludes legislators and intermediate representatives, which are the hallmark of a representative democracy, in which citizens elect representatives to legislate on their behalf. Nowadays, the size, scope, and complexity of nation-states and laws makes it very difficult for a direct democracy to function well, meaning that all democracies in the world today function primarily as representative ones, using those same legislators and intermediate representatives. However, these systems can create different impacts, with direct democracies empowering individuals to act solely on their political leanings, while representative ones can produce different results given the election of representatives, often who are members of political parties with defined views. One common issue throughout all civilizations, democratic or not, is the allocation of resources. In Muslim history, the nomadic roots of the Seljuks influenced how they allocated resources, spending much on war and conquest, and rather little on farming and building institutions. However, today, with resources in limited supply and human wants seemingly unlimited, resources and their allocation are an oft-debated issue. And in modern economies, with free enterprise systems, the distribution of resources is based on the price system, in which consumers influence the distribution of resources based on what they're willing to pay for, while in command or centrally planned economies, those decisions are political. How this ties back into democracy is that in a system where the majority is able to make decisions over the minority, resources are often distributed unfairly. And indeed, even in a country as seemingly democratic as Canada, these things occur with alarming frequency. For example, in British Columbia, it was found that BC communities represented by Liberal MLAs were more likely to get lucrative transportation projects such as highway maintenance, road widening, and new bridges, compared to those in ridings held by MPs from another party. And indeed, the BC Liberal government spent $1.3 billion on such projects since 2013, as of 2017. Now, there are some other inherent challenges that come with rule of the people. As I mentioned, with representative democracy, leaders are elected to represent supposedly the views of their constituents, but often have to adhere to other policies and interests. In addition, at least in countries like Canada that use a constituency-based system, elected leaders only represent really their direct constituents, rather than the people or the best interests of the people as a whole. And this same problem is often present as well in direct democracies, where leaders are not accountable to necessarily the general populace. Now, the fundamental flaw with rule of the people can be characterized as an uneducated or disinterested population. In the case of these democratic systems, the populace is expected to know what is in their best interests and to make their decisions accordingly. But the fact remains that most people have neither the education nor the commitment to make these decisions and form positions on complex policies. To quote one notable author, "This is not so with politics. How all of us vote collectively matters a great deal, but how any one of us votes does not." Imagine a college professor told her class of 210 million students, 3 months from now, we'll have a final exam. You won't get your own personal grade. Instead, I'll average out all of your grades together, and everyone will receive the same grade. As you can imagine, no one would bother to study, and the average grade would probably be an F. This problem can be described as voter apathy, with the sense that an individual doesn't matter, an individual doesn't care, and participation in democratic systems decline. This is by no means a new phenomenon, but it has recently began to deeply affect new Western democracies, such as in Canada and much of the rest of the Western world, where voter turnout rarely reaches above 70%, even in important national level elections. Another major facet of democracy and liberal democracy today has to do with electoral politics, or the representative democratic system of election to legislative, executive, and sometimes judicial offices, which deeply affects decision-making. The fundamental flaw with this aspect can be summed up as the impacts of repeated electoral cycles in which candidates try to win over people and secure future votes to get another term in office. Now, this has several effects, manifesting itself as short-sightedness, a lack of continuity in governance, and the making and breaking of often unreasonable promises, as well as the affording of advantages to certain candidates over others. With regards to lack of continuity, with 4 to 6 year cycles predominating among most Western democracies today, governments are liable to change frequently, leading to not only economic instability, but also disruption in political affairs and long-term projects, such as infrastructure and economic plans, which are consistently altered with changing governments. This also affects the cycle of promises, which, in order, as I mentioned, to appeal to voters, candidates propose popular and often populist reforms, such as universal childcare, the abolition of tolls, or reduction of taxes, which in many cases cannot be properly or sustainably delivered without far-reaching unseen impacts. And in many jurisdictions, as I mentioned before, with the affording of certain advantages to some candidates over others, candidates can receive large sums from wealthy donors and corporations, whereas though this is not as well a recent phenomenon, for example, the influence of merchants on governance when they were trading on the Silk Road was enormous. Even though that was not a democratic society, their financial contributions were able to influence the governance and allow them to benefit themselves over others. Today, this advantages not only wealthy candidates who have the money to fund themselves, but also those who are able to appeal to the well-heeled. These typically more conservative parties are able to, in some cases, even buy an election using contributions from the upper class to buy advertising for the masses. Now, democracy is not the only way of government by far. And what I wish to present to you today is that it is not the only way to achieve personal freedom, and that personal freedom is not reliant on democratic systems. Many of you may have heard this famous quote from Sir Winston Churchill, which says, "Many forms of government have been tried and will be tried in this world of sin and woe. No one pretends that democracy is perfect or all-wise. Indeed, it has been said that democracy is the worst form of government, except for all those other forms that have been tried from time to time." Now, while democracy often works well in preserving individual freedom, it is far from perfect, as I said, being supplanted by several others in many regards. In history, tolerance and pluralism have been embraced by several non-democratic civilizations, notably the Fatimid Empire in Egypt, which, despite being led by Muslims, abolish the jizya or tax on non-Muslims, and embrace diverse religious practices, including those of Christians and Jews. As His Highness the Aga Khan again said, some people make the mistake of thinking that pluralism requires them to dilute or de-emphasize their own distinctive identities. That's not true. What it requires is to ensure that one's individual identity is strong enough to engage confidently with those of other identities as we all walk together along the road to a better world. I will now give to you one example of a system in which individual rights flourished despite the absence of democracy. As the architect of the French Fifth Republic, Charles de Gaulle's France was highly autocratic while still protecting individual rights and freedoms. Greatly influenced by the collapse of the weak executive structure of the Fourth Republic, de Gaulle created a strong semi-presidential system in which the president, while nominally only the head of state, held the most executive authority and could even override the elected National Assembly in certain cases. And during his tenure, France was often likened to a republican monarchy rather than a representative democracy. Yet, due to the strong protections of rights and freedoms in the Constitution, as well as some famous documents like the Declaration of the Rights of Man, individual freedom was still protected despite the absence of a strong democracy. One of many, this example demonstrates the need for strong rights protections or a benevolent dictator, and not necessarily democracy in protecting rights. As many of you are aware, in the United States, for example, the majority in many conservative states, which have a Republican government, are able to restrict women's access to abortion, which, while being democratic, is viewed by some as infringing on their rights. And in addition to many other modern examples as well, this only illustrates the need for rights protections rather than democracy itself in ensuring freedom for people. So, what have we heard about democracy today? We've heard about the different forms of democracy and its origins, as well as challenges with modern democracy, and indeed a lack of fairness in many respects, with political contributions allowing certain people to influence elections and the results of governance, with the allocation of resources being arguably corrupted through the rule of certain people, as well as the influence of the wealthy, and with electoral politics resulting in disjointed and fragmented governance. It can be said for certain that democracy is flawed in many ways. In addition to the example of France that I brought up earlier, there are many other examples of how rights can be protected without democracy and have similar impacts. And these alternatives have existed across time and place, just as democracy itself has. Systems like Singapore, like Oman, and in many other countries throughout the centuries have proven to us that democracy is by no means essential for the protection of individual rights. So today I would like you to carefully consider the fairness of democracy. Is the system that allows these things to happen, that allows the majority, in many cases, to take away the rights of minority if they are not protected, that allows certain individuals to have an undue influence on democratic outcomes and policies, and that allows for a political class to have undue control over many of those policies as well, the best system we can have to govern ourselves by. Though our freedom may seem intact today, the decline of participation in democracy will undoubtedly lead to a changing political landscape in which those freedoms are no longer guaranteed. As participation in democracy dwindles and the political class becomes more powerful, we must carefully consider how we wish to govern ourselves. Is democracy fair? But more importantly, is it the way we want to govern ourselves? Thank you.